My name is Marissa, and at 31 years old, I have finally learned what it means to create a life that no one else can take away from me. But the truth behind that strength is painful. I spent my entire childhood watching my family leave me behind. When they packed their suitcases for vacations, there was never a place for me. I would stand at the window, watching the car pull out of the driveway, my siblings in the back seat with wide grins, while I remained home with some excuse about why it just wasn't possible for me to go. Those moments carved into me a sense of invisibility I could never fully shake. Before I take you through the story of how I transformed that neglect into the most defining decision of my life, I want to pause here. Please take a second to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means more than you know. It's how these true stories keep going and how voices like mine are finally heard. From the outside, my childhood looked enviable. We lived in a neat, middle-class neighborhood in Pennsylvania, the kind of place with trimmed lawns, block parties, and family photos taped proudly in the windows. My father worked in finance, always crisp in his suits, while my mother perfected the role of homemaker, ensuring our home was spotless and our appearances equally polished. My older brother and younger sister both fit seamlessly into that picture. They wore matching polos for vacations, smiled effortlessly for photos, and embodied the perfect family my parents wanted to display to the world. And then there was me, the child who didn't quite match the mold. I wasn't loud or rebellious. I wasn't wild or difficult. I was simply different. My interests leaned toward books, writing, and observing rather than performing. I didn't crave the spotlight, but I craved belonging. And yet, belonging was always out of reach. The first time I was excluded from a family trip, I was only 6 years old. They were going to Florida. I remember overhearing my mother on the phone, explaining to a friend that it was easier this way. Easier for who? Certainly not for me, the child who stayed behind with an aunt while my siblings got sunburnt on beaches and laughed over ice cream cones. When they returned, I listened quietly as they retold their adventures, but no one ever asked me how I had felt while they were gone. It became a pattern. As I grew older, I learned not to expect inclusion. Every summer the cycle repeated. Suitcases appeared in the hallway, my siblings bragged about destinations, and I found myself left in silence, told it was too expensive or that someone had to stay behind. Always me. Always the one chosen to be forgotten. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped asking questions. I would simply watch them go and bury myself in fantasies, magazines with glossy pictures of faraway cities, library books about countries I could only dream of visiting, maps I traced with my fingers, promising myself that one day I would stand in those places myself. The most painful part wasn't missing the vacations. It was the message hidden beneath the decision. Each time they left me behind, I absorbed the same lesson. You don't matter enough to be included. You are not worth the seat, the cost, or the memory. That kind of wound doesn't fade quickly. It grows roots, shaping how you see yourself and how you think the world will always see you. For years, I carried that shame in silence. I excelled in school, but even my achievements seemed invisible compared to my siblings' sports trophies and family trip photos proudly displayed on the living room wall. In those frames, my absence was never questioned. No one wondered why I wasn't smiling on a beach or standing in front of some famous landmark. To the world, our family looked complete. To me, I was a ghost inside my own home. By the time I reached adulthood, I had convinced myself I didn't need what they denied me. I told myself vacations were frivolous, that success came from discipline, not enjoyment. But beneath that surface, the hunger never left. I longed not just to see the world, but to feel chosen, to feel worthy of the space I had always been denied. That longing sat quietly in me, waiting for the moment when I would finally have the power to choose for myself. And that moment came years later, when I boarded a plane to Europe, carrying nothing but the savings I had scraped together and a determination that this journey would belong only to me. No family, no permission, no apologies. Just me and the world that had once felt so impossibly out of reach. That was the beginning of everything. The silent revenge, the unexpected freedom, and the story I'm about to share. From the outside, my family looked like the picture of stability. Our home sat on a quiet suburban street in Pennsylvania, with flower beds carefully maintained by my mother and a freshly painted white fence my father insisted on keeping spotless. Neighbors often commented on how put together we seemed, how lucky my siblings and I were to be raised in such an environment. But photographs and appearances rarely tell the whole story. Behind those trimmed hedges and smiling portraits, there was a hierarchy I would come to understand far too young. In my family, not all children were chosen equally. I was the middle child, positioned between an older brother who commanded attention and a younger sister who fit the role of the cherished baby. My brother excelled in sports, tall and confident even as a child. My sister was sweet, charming, and seemed to hold a permanent place in everyone's good graces. And then there was me. Quiet, reflective, more inclined toward books and notebooks than competitions or charm. There was nothing dramatic about me, nothing loud. But in a family that valued image above all else, my lack of flash meant I could disappear without consequence. The first real fracture came when I was 6. That summer, my family planned a trip to Florida, complete with tickets to theme parks and beach days. I remember watching my mother pack the suitcases, folding matching outfits for my siblings while my name was never mentioned. At the time, I convinced myself it was an oversight, that surely I would be included. But when the day arrived, I was dropped off at my aunt's house, my small backpack in hand, told only that it was easier this way. I remember standing at her window, staring out as my parents' car disappeared down the road, the back seat filled with laughter and excitement that didn't include me. My aunt gave me ice cream and tried to distract me with cartoons, but no amount of comfort erased the hollow feeling in my chest. When they returned, sun-kissed and overflowing with stories, I sat quietly at the dinner table while they recounted their adventures. I nodded and smiled, but inside, I was unraveling. It was the first time I realized I could be erased from family experiences without anyone even blinking. The following years only reinforced that lesson. Vacations became annual rituals that somehow never had room for me. Sometimes the excuse was money, other times it was logistics, but it was always me who stayed behind. My siblings collected souvenirs and stories while I collected the silence of empty summers. I built a world of imagination to compensate, tracing maps from library books, circling countries I hoped to see one day, and cutting pictures of European cities from old magazines to tape on my bedroom wall. My travels existed only in paper and ink, a poor substitute for the reality I was denied. What made it worse was the facade my family maintained. To neighbors and extended relatives, we were the perfect unit. Holiday cards showed smiling faces from beaches I had never stepped on, ski trips I had never taken. I was included in some pictures, posed in our front yard or dressed for Christmas. But those photos were always local, never the ones where real memories were made. In my absence, my family never explained why I wasn't there. It was easier, perhaps, to pretend I didn't exist in those moments, to present the illusion of a family complete enough without me. As I grew older, I began to measure my worth against those omissions. My siblings were valued enough to make memories with. I was the one who could be left behind, the one whose presence or absence made no real difference. That message etched itself into my bones. Even in school, when teachers asked about family vacations, I would invent small lies to cover the truth. I didn't want to admit that while others built memories on road trips or overseas journeys, I had spent my summers reading books on a porch, waiting for the sound of a car to signal their return. One summer when I was 9, they traveled to California. I remember it clearly because I had begged to go, begged in the quiet way children do when they know their words carry little weight. My pleas made no difference. That summer, I stayed again with my aunt. Each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the ocean they were seeing, the photos they would take without me, the laughter I could only hear in my mind. When they came home, the living room filled with souvenirs and trinkets, a snow globe for my sister, a jersey for my brother, keychains and postcards they proudly passed around. For me, there was nothing. I asked if perhaps they had forgotten, and my mother simply said, "You already have enough things." That answer sliced deeper than she could have known. It wasn't about the trinket, it was about acknowledgement. A small token would have been proof that I had at least been thought of. But even that was too much to ask. By the time I reached middle school, I had stopped asking. I no longer begged or even expected inclusion. Instead, I buried myself in schoolwork, finding solace in grades and recognition from teachers that I never received at home. I became the responsible one, the self-sufficient child who caused no trouble. If they were going to forget me, I would make sure I at least gave them no reason to criticize. But that survival strategy only deepened the distance. The quieter I became, the easier it was for them to leave me out without guilt. Looking back now, I can see how those early experiences planted seeds that shaped everything that came later. I learned too young that love in my family was conditional. That presence was a privilege I had not earned. And when you grow up believing you are an afterthought, it changes the way you move through the world. It makes you cautious, hesitant, always bracing for rejection. It makes you wonder if maybe you truly don't deserve to belong. But buried beneath that doubt was a quiet ember. Each time I watched them drive away, each time I was left holding nothing but silence, that ember grew hotter. It whispered that one day I would go. That one day I would stand on those beaches, walk through those cities, and create memories not because someone allowed me to, but because I claimed them for myself. For years, that ember was all I had, and though I didn't know it then, it would become the fire that carried me across an ocean to places my family never thought I would see, on a journey that belonged only to me. Adolescence was supposed to be the time when I discovered who I was, when I built my identity among peers, hobbies, and experiences that shaped the future. For most people, the teenage years are messy but alive, filled with memories of trips, summer camps, and family bonding that create the foundation of adulthood. For me, those years were marked not by what I gained, but by what I consistently lost. The chance to belong, even within my own family. I remember standing at the window of our living room more times than I can count. The suitcases would be lined neatly in the hall, packed with care and anticipation, my mother's handwriting on the luggage tags. My father would check tickets and reservations, his voice brisk and efficient as he coordinated the logistics. My siblings laughed in the background, their excitement building as they anticipated the adventures ahead. And me? I stood silently, pressed against the glass, watching the car pull away without me. The driveway would empty, and with it, any illusion that I mattered enough to be included. As a teenager, the pain cut sharper. When I was younger, I could convince myself I was too small, too quiet, perhaps not ready. But as the years passed, I realized the truth. It wasn't about age or readiness. It was about priorities, and I had never been one of them. That realization hardened into something I carried with me every day. In high school, the stories my classmates shared only highlighted the emptiness I felt. Friends returned from vacations with sunburns, souvenirs, and inside jokes that would carry them through the year. They spoke casually about trips to Disney World, ski resorts, or family reunions by the lake. I nodded along, pretending I had similar stories, but the truth was, my summers were spent alone, reading novels on the porch, scribbling notes in journals, or sitting at the kitchen table with my aunt while the rest of my family was miles away. There was one particular summer when they traveled to Europe. I was 15. I had begged quietly for years to be included, saving pictures from magazines of Paris, Rome, and London. The thought of standing beneath the Eiffel Tower or walking through the ruins of Rome felt like magic, a dream that could heal all the times I had been left behind. But once again, I was not chosen. They told neighbors about their plans, my siblings bragged about their upcoming adventure, and I sat in the background, invisible. When the day came, I was left with my aunt again. That summer, while they explored landmarks and tasted food I could only imagine, I sat in a small Pennsylvania kitchen, peeling vegetables and staring at maps I had traced so many times I had memorized them. When they returned, they filled our home with souvenirs and stories. My brother displayed a miniature Colosseum in his room, my sister wore a scarf from Paris, and my parents added framed photos to the hallway wall. The images were glossy and beautiful, my family smiling in front of cathedrals, fountains, and monuments. As I walked down that hallway every day, I felt like a ghost haunting photographs of a life I was never invited to live. The exclusion extended beyond vacations. School breaks that should have been filled with family trips were instead times of isolation. While my siblings joined sports camps and enrichment programs, I was often left with little more than books and notebooks. I poured my longing into writing, sketching stories of girls who traveled the world, who found belonging in faraway places. Those stories became my refuge, but they were also a reminder of what I lacked. What stung the most was the silence that followed these exclusions. No one ever explained why. No one ever apologized. It was simply accepted that I would not be there, and life carried on as though nothing were missing. That silence was almost worse than the act itself, because it suggested that my absence was natural, expected, and unremarkable. By 16, I had grown used to masking my hurt. At school, I presented myself as composed, diligent, focused on academics. Teachers praised my discipline, and I leaned into that praise, using it as proof that I had value, even if my family didn't see it. I became the one who always delivered assignments on time, who volunteered to help, who excelled at everything I touched. But behind the perfect grades was a girl who felt profoundly unwanted. The window became a symbol for me during those years. Each time I stood behind the glass, watching my family leave, I felt trapped between two worlds. The world of motion, adventure, and belonging that they enjoyed, and the stagnant, quiet world I was left with. That window reflected my face back at me, a reminder that I was on the wrong side of the glass, locked out of experiences that should have been mine. Over time, I learned to channel my pain into determination. I promised myself that one day I would not watch from the window anymore. One day, I would walk through airports with a ticket of my own, board planes with no one's permission, and see the world that had always been kept just out of reach. I didn't know how or when, but I clung to that promise as though it were a lifeline. The teenage years cemented the divide between me and my family. The gap that began in childhood widened into a chasm I could no longer ignore. They built memories without me, framed them, and displayed them proudly, while I built resilience in silence. That silence became both my shield and my prison. It kept me strong, but it also kept me lonely. Looking back now, I realize that those years were less about vacations and more about what they symbolized. It wasn't about beaches or monuments. It was about worth. Being excluded from those trips taught me, over and over again, that I wasn't worth the cost of a plane ticket, the space in a hotel room, or the effort it took to include me. And when you grow up learning that lesson, it carves into your heart a question you carry everywhere. If your own family doesn't want you, whoever will? That question followed me into adulthood, whispering in moments of doubt and shadowing every achievement. But beneath it, there remained the ember of defiance, the quiet promise that one day I would not need their seat at the table or their place in the car. One day, I would create my own journey, not as a passenger in someone else's life, but as the author of my own. And that day would come sooner than I realized. By the time I left for college, I had already built a reputation for being the responsible one, the quiet achiever who caused no trouble. My grades were excellent, my extracurriculars neatly documented, and on paper, I looked like the kind of child any parent would be proud of. But the truth behind that image was more complicated. The invisible wounds from my childhood had followed me into young adulthood, shaping the way I carried myself, the way I believed others saw me, and most painfully, the way I saw myself. College should have been a fresh start, a chance to reinvent myself far away from the small Pennsylvania suburb where I had always been the forgotten one. And in some ways, it was. I was surrounded by new people, people who didn't know my history, who didn't already view me as the expendable child. But old patterns are hard to escape. I found myself falling into the same rhythms, keeping my head down, working tirelessly, always striving to prove that I belonged. It was during my first winter break that the cracks became impossible to ignore. I returned home, expecting, for once, to be included in family plans. My siblings were buzzing with excitement over a trip to Mexico my parents had organized, their laughter filling the living room as they traded thoughts about excursions and resorts. I listened quietly, waiting for my name to be included, waiting for some acknowledgement that this time would be different. But the acknowledgement never came. My presence wasn't even a question worth answering. Within days, the suitcases were packed, and I found myself once again standing in the doorway as the car pulled away, left behind in the same house I had always called home, but which had never truly felt like mine. The realization that struck me that winter was harsher than any before. Nothing had changed. I was no longer a child. I was nearly 20, an adult capable of making my own choices, yet still I was treated as though I didn't exist when it came to family memories. It wasn't about money anymore, or logistics, or excuses. It was about the roles we had all been assigned long ago, roles my family refused to change. My siblings were the chosen ones, and I was the one who didn't count. The pain of that trip lingered long after they returned. When I scrolled through photos they posted online, smiling on beaches, lounging at pools, gathered around tables filled with food, I felt a familiar hollowness in my chest. It wasn't just jealousy. It was grief. Grief for the years of memories I would never have. Grief for the version of myself who might have felt loved if only she had been invited. Grief for the fact that my family didn't even seem to notice my absence. That grief slowly transformed into anger. For so long, I had swallowed my hurt, convincing myself it wasn't worth speaking up, that silence was safer than rejection. But something inside me shifted that winter. I began to realize that silence was its own kind of prison, and I had been locking myself inside of it for years. Every unspoken word, every swallowed plea, every quiet acceptance of exclusion had built the walls higher and higher until I could barely see beyond them. The next summer only deepened that resolve. While my parents funded another vacation for my siblings, this time to Hawaii, I took on extra shifts at my campus job. I worked in the library, filing books and answering questions, the hum of fluorescent lights replacing the sound of ocean waves I had once longed to hear. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every paycheck was proof that I could build something outside of my family's control. I began to tuck away money in an envelope I kept hidden in my dorm room, small bills that represented something more than financial security. They represented possibility. As the months passed, I became more aware of the emotional distance between me and the family I was supposed to feel tied to. When I called home, conversations were brief, perfunctory, always circling around my siblings' achievements and adventures. My own accomplishments, scholarships, high grades, recognition from professors, were brushed aside. It became clear that nothing I did would ever be enough to bridge the gap between us. The breaking point came when I realized that the exclusion wasn't just about vacations anymore. It was about the story my family chose to tell about themselves, a story in which I was nothing more than a footnote, easily erased when inconvenient. I began to understand that the pattern would never stop unless I stopped waiting for them to change. That was when the ember that had lived quietly in me since childhood began to glow brighter. I started to dream differently, not just of being included, but of carving a place for myself where no one could exclude me again. I began to imagine what it would feel like to hold a plane ticket in my own name, to stand in a place I had only traced with my fingers on maps, to create memories no one else could take from me. It was both terrifying and exhilarating to allow myself to believe that such a future was possible. For so long, my identity had been tied to rejection, to the idea that I wasn't worth the cost of inclusion. But slowly, I started to rewrite that story. Each hour I worked, each dollar I saved, each small act of independence was proof that I didn't need their permission to exist fully. Looking back now, I see that college wasn't just about lectures and exams. It was about unlearning the lessons my family had carved into me. It was about realizing that love isn't supposed to be conditional, that belonging shouldn't have to be earned by shrinking yourself or proving your worth. Most of all, it was about facing the truth that if my family would never give me the seat at the table I longed for, I would build my own table somewhere else. That decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost invisible to anyone else. But inside, it marked the moment I stopped waiting. The moment I stopped believing that my family's approval was the key to my happiness. The moment I began, however tentatively, to imagine a life where I was no longer the forgotten one. And though I didn't yet know how, I promised myself that the next chapter of my life would not be defined by absence. It would be defined by choice. The moment I decided to stop waiting for my family to choose me was also the moment I began building something of my own. At first, it didn't look like much. just a few crumpled bills tucked away in an envelope I hid in my dorm room desk. But to me, those small pieces of paper were more than money. They were freedom. They were the first proof that I had the power to give myself the experiences my family had always denied me. I started saving during my second year of college. By then, the pattern was unshakably clear. My siblings were off on another trip, this time to Greece, their social media feeds full of smiling photos on whitewashed streets and dazzling coastlines. I watched from my dorm room, the glow of my laptop illuminating my face, my chest tightening with a mix of jealousy, grief, and determination. I couldn't erase the years of exclusion, but I could change what came next. I worked 2 part-time jobs in addition to my studies. At the campus library, I shelved books and answered questions, the quiet rhythm of the work soothing in a way. At a nearby cafe, I wiped down tables, brewed coffee, and learned the art of moving quickly under pressure. The pay wasn't glamorous, but every shift meant another dollar I could fold into my envelope, another step closer to proving to myself that I didn't have to live behind the glass of my childhood window anymore. That envelope became my secret. No one knew about it, not even my closest friends. It lived in the back of my drawer, underneath stacks of papers and notebooks, hidden from view. I would open it late at night, counting the bills one by one, letting the weight of them ground me. Sometimes, when I felt particularly invisible, I would hold that money in my hands and remind myself, this is mine, not my family's, not something they could take or deny. Mine. The discipline it required was intense. While my peers went out to dinners or bought new clothes, I taught myself to live with less. I brewed cheap coffee at home, thrifted my wardrobe, and skipped nights out unless I could join without spending. I wasn't just saving for the sake of saving. I was saving for something bigger, something that would rewrite the story of my life. I didn't have the details yet, but I knew it would involve travel. I knew it would take me to the places I had only traced on maps, the places that had always been just out of reach. Every dollar was a reminder of the difference between me and my siblings. While they were handed trips and experiences without a second thought, I was clawing my way toward mine. At first, the unfairness of it burned. But over time, I began to see the hidden gift in my exclusion. My siblings had never needed to work for the memories they were given. For them, trips were simply another item on the family calendar. For me, each step forward was deliberate, intentional, earned. My memories would be built by my own hands, and that made them infinitely more precious. The process of saving wasn't just financial, it was emotional. With every bill I tucked away, I was also storing something less tangible. Hope. Hope that I wasn't as powerless as my family had made me feel. Hope that I could choose myself even when they hadn't. Hope that one day I would step onto a plane and into a life that finally belonged to me. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when exhaustion gnawed at me, when I questioned whether all the sacrifice was worth it. I would scroll through my siblings' photos, their effortless smiles mocking me, and wonder if I was foolish to believe I could ever catch up. But then I would open my envelope, count the bills again, and remind myself that even if I was behind, I was at least moving forward. The envelope grew heavier with time. What started as a few wrinkled bills became neat stacks of 20s, then 50s, then the occasional 100 when I managed to set aside more. I tracked my progress in a notebook, marking down every deposit like a secret ritual. Those numbers became my proof that I was capable of building something no one could take from me. By my final year of college, I had saved enough to feel the possibility of real travel within reach. I didn't tell anyone, not even my aunt who had always been kind to me, because the secrecy was part of its power. For once in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission. For once, I wasn't waiting for an invitation that would never come. This was mine alone. The day I realized I could actually afford a plane ticket was one of the most emotional moments of my life. I sat on my dorm bed, laptop open, searching flights to Europe with trembling hands. The numbers that had once seemed impossible, hundreds, even thousands of dollars, were suddenly within my reach. I didn't book the ticket yet. I wasn't ready to make it real. But knowing that I could, that the choice was finally in my hands, filled me with a sense of power I had never known. It was more than money. It was liberation. For the first time, I wasn't the forgotten child waiting at a window for someone else to decide if I mattered. I was the one deciding. Looking back, those years of saving were just as important as the trip itself. They taught me resilience, discipline, and the value of claiming something for myself. Each dollar was like a brick in the foundation of a new life, one where I was no longer defined by what I had been denied. I didn't know it then, but I was building more than a travel fund. I was building proof of my own strength, evidence that I could step beyond the story my family had written for me. And when the time finally came to buy that ticket, I would step into a chapter of my life that no one could erase. The envelope that had once been thin and fragile was now thick with possibility. I had counted and recounted the bills so many times that I could feel their weight in my hands even when I wasn't holding them. With every passing month, the number grew larger, and so did the quiet, pulsing thought that I might finally be able to do what I had promised myself since childhood. Leave. Not just metaphorically, not just in dreams traced on maps or magazines, but truly, physically leave. The idea of Europe had always hovered in the background of my imagination. It was the place my family had gone without me, the trip that had broken me most deeply when I was a teenager. They had walked cobblestone streets, eaten foods I could only imagine, and taken photographs I could never step into. To go there now, on my own terms, felt like more than travel. It felt like reclamation. I began to plan quietly, almost obsessively. Late at night, after finishing assignments or long shifts, I would open my laptop and scroll through images of cities that had once seemed impossibly far away. Paris, with its glowing lights and towering Eiffel Tower. Rome, where history seemed carved into every stone. Barcelona, alive with colors and rhythm. I devoured travel blogs, watched videos, studied train routes, and traced maps the same way I had as a child. But now, it was different. This time, the possibility was real. Every detail became part of my secret plan. I researched budget airlines, compared hostels, and made lists of places I wanted to see. I created a hidden folder on my computer labeled innocuously, filled with saved itineraries and notes. My notebooks, once covered in sketches and fragments of longing, now held practical details, conversion rates, estimated daily costs, the names of neighborhoods where I might stay. Each word I wrote felt like building a bridge from my old life to the new one I was creating. The secrecy was intoxicating. For the first time, I held something my family couldn't touch, couldn't erase, couldn't deny me. They didn't know about the envelope. They didn't know about the folder. They didn't know that the child they had once deemed unworthy of a seat in the car was now quietly constructing an escape route across an ocean. I carried that secret like a flame in my chest, warming me on the days when their absence still stung. It wasn't just about seeing Europe. It was about taking back power. My whole life had been shaped by decisions I never had a say in. They decided where to go. They decided who went. They decided who mattered. Planning this trip was my way of rewriting the story. Each detail I researched, each ticket I considered, each city I dreamed of visiting was a declaration. I matter enough to choose for myself. The planning consumed me in the best possible way. While other students stressed about internships and graduate school, I poured myself into itineraries and flight trackers. I checked prices daily, learning the rhythm of costs, the fluctuations of seasons. I taught myself how to stretch money as far as it would go, how to eat cheaply while still experiencing culture, how to travel smart and safe as a woman alone. It wasn't just logistics, it was empowerment. I was proving to myself that I could do this, that I had the intelligence and resourcefulness to build an experience no one else could control. Sometimes, when exhaustion from work and classes pressed heavily on me, I would imagine stepping off a plane into a foreign airport, the air filled with languages I didn't understand. I would imagine the first time I saw the Eiffel Tower not in a photograph but in the flesh, the lights shimmering against the night sky. I would imagine standing in Rome, my hand resting on the rough surface of a ruin older than anything I had ever known. These visions carried me forward, fueling me through the hardest days. What struck me most was how alive the planning made me feel. For years, my life had been about absence, being left behind, being invisible, being unchosen. Now, for the first time, I was full of anticipation. I had something that belonged only to me, something my family couldn't take away. They might never know the hours I spent researching, or the quiet joy I felt when I realized I had enough saved to afford not just a plane ticket, but weeks of travel. And that was the beauty of it. For once, my story wasn't theirs to narrate. The secrecy also gave me a sense of safety. I knew that if I shared my plans, they would find a way to diminish them. They might mock me, or suggest it wasn't practical, or remind me of everything that could go wrong. Keeping it hidden allowed me to protect the fragile hope I was nurturing. I didn't want anyone's voice but my own in this decision. By the time graduation approached, my plan had solidified. I would give myself the gift my family had always withheld. I would go to Europe. I would see the places I had dreamed of since childhood, not as the forgotten child tagging along, but as a woman who had built this journey on her own. I didn't know exactly how it would feel, but I knew it would change me. Looking back, those months of planning were as transformative as the trip itself would be. They taught me patience, discipline, and the quiet power of holding a dream close until it was strong enough to carry me. I had spent years standing at windows, watching cars drive away without me. Now, I was standing at the edge of something entirely different. The chance to board a plane with no one's permission, no one's approval, and no one's oversight. It was more than an escape. It was a rebirth. And as the day of departure drew closer, I carried not just tickets and plans, but the unshakable knowledge that this time, I wasn't being left behind. This time, I was the one leaving. The air inside the plane was dry and heavy, but when the wheels touched down on the runway in Paris, I felt a rush of oxygen as though I had been holding my breath for my entire life. The brakes screeched, the engines roared, and suddenly, I was not just imagining anymore. I was here. The girl who had stood at the window watching her family's car pull away without her had somehow crossed an ocean, not as a tag-along, not as an afterthought, but as the author of her own escape. Stepping into the airport, I was overwhelmed by the hum of languages I couldn't understand, announcements echoing across terminals, and the blur of people rushing toward trains, taxis, and reunions. For a moment, I simply stood still, letting the crowd move around me, my heart pounding with disbelief. I had dreamed of this moment for so long that it felt unreal, as if at any second someone might appear and tell me it wasn't really mine. But no one came. This was mine. The first breath of air outside the airport was sharp with the chill of European spring, tinged with the faint smell of exhaust and rain. Even that scent felt holy to me. Proof that I was on ground my family had once claimed for themselves, ground they had decided I was unworthy to touch. Now my shoes hit the same pavement they had walked years before, but on my own terms. I wasn't following in their footsteps. I was reclaiming the path they had once stolen from me. The train into the city rattled with energy, neon signs flashing past the windows as I pressed my forehead against the glass, unable to blink in case I missed something. The rhythm of the wheels matched the rhythm of my pulse, fast, relentless, alive. When the skyline appeared, dotted with rooftops and the distant silhouette of the Eiffel Tower, tears welled in my eyes. I had seen it so many times in pictures, taped to my bedroom wall, traced with my finger across maps. But seeing it emerge in front of me felt like stepping into a dream I had been denied my entire life. Walking through Paris for the first time was like learning to breathe again. The cobblestones beneath my feet carried centuries of history. The buildings rose with elegance I had only ever seen in photographs, and every corner seemed alive with music, laughter, and smells of food drifting from cafes. I wandered aimlessly, not caring where I ended up, because every step was a victory. I had been excluded so many times that now, simply existing here felt like the most profound act of defiance. Meals tasted different when they weren't eaten in silence while waiting for a family to return home. A simple croissant, warm and flaking in my hands, felt like an offering from the universe itself. Coffee sipped slowly at a cafe table felt like communion, proof that I could sit in the world and take up space without needing permission. Even water tasted new, carried in glass bottles with condensation dripping down the sides, sparkling in the light of foreign sun. I filled my days with everything my family had once denied me. I walked along the Seine, watching artists sketch by the water. I wandered through museums, standing in front of paintings I had only ever seen in textbooks, overwhelmed by their size and presence. I let myself get lost in winding streets, guided by curiosity instead of obligation. Each step was a declaration. I am here, and I belong. But it wasn't just about seeing Paris. It was about shedding the weight of invisibility I had carried for so long. Each moment became symbolic, each sight a reminder of what I had overcome. When I stood before the Eiffel Tower at night, its lights glittering against the dark sky, I thought of all the nights I had spent staring out the window of my childhood home, watching my family drive away. The contrast nearly broke me. Then, instead of breaking, it remade me. The tears that streamed down my face weren't just of awe, they were of healing. For the first time, I wasn't on the outside looking in. I was in. Traveling alone terrified me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were moments of confusion, moments where I didn't know the language, moments where I felt small against the enormity of the world. But even in those moments, I felt stronger than I ever had. Every obstacle I navigated alone was proof that I didn't need anyone else to validate my place in the world. For so long, I had believed that belonging came from being chosen by others. Now I understood that belonging could be chosen by me. After Paris, I took trains to other cities: Rome, Barcelona, Amsterdam. Each new place layered itself into me, filling the hollow spaces my family had carved out. I marveled at ruins older than memory, let myself be pulled into the rhythm of new cultures, and stood in cathedrals where the silence itself seemed to echo with centuries of prayers. At every stop, I felt myself growing, not into someone new, but into the person I had always been before rejection had silenced her. Traveling without telling anyone back home gave me a thrill that no one could take from me. It was my secret rebellion, my silent revenge. While my family continued living in their carefully crafted bubble, I was thousands of miles away, living a life they had once decided I didn't deserve. For years, they had excluded me from vacations. Now I had excluded them from mine, and that reversal carried a satisfaction deeper than words. Yet it wasn't just about revenge, it was about release. Each city I visited loosened the grip of the past a little more. Each step away from my childhood home carried me closer to a life defined not by absence, but by presence. I was no longer the forgotten child. I was the woman who had crossed an ocean, who had stood beneath the Eiffel Tower, who had touched the stones of the Colosseum, who had carved her own story from the silence. By the time my weeks abroad came to an end, I knew I was no longer the same person who had boarded that plane. I returned with a suitcase full of postcards, train tickets, and souvenirs. But more importantly, I returned with something I had never carried before: proof. Proof that I could create my own life. Proof that I didn't need my family's permission to exist fully. Proof that even after years of exclusion, I had found a way to belong, to myself, to the world, and to the future I was finally ready to claim. When I returned from Europe, I carried with me more than just a suitcase of souvenirs. I carried the quiet knowledge that I had lived the life my family always told me I couldn't have. I had walked their streets, stood in their monuments, eaten in their cafes. But I had done it without them. For the first time, I had been the one to leave, and that reversal changed me in ways I could never have imagined. At first, I thought perhaps they would never know. I hadn't shared pictures on social media, hadn't told anyone except for a few trusted friends outside of family. I liked the secrecy, the way it gave me a private victory no one could diminish. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks, and mine did. Months later, when I thought the trip had been tucked neatly into the vault of my independence, they found out. It happened through photographs. A friend I had traveled with briefly shared a post online, tagging me without realizing how carefully I had concealed my movements. Suddenly, the evidence was there for everyone to see. Me standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, me at the Colosseum, me smiling by the canals in Amsterdam. For anyone else, they would have been just vacation pictures. For my family, they were a betrayal. The backlash was swift. My siblings confronted me with questions disguised as accusations, their voices heavy with disbelief. How could I have gone so far without saying anything? How could I have afforded it? How could I have kept it hidden? But beneath their shock was something more telling, the realization that I had slipped beyond their control. For years, they had written me out of the story. Now, I had written them out of mine. My parents' reaction was even harsher. They saw my trip not as an achievement, but as defiance. To them, independence wasn't celebrated. It was a threat. I could feel their disapproval in every cold silence, every narrowed look, every unspoken sentence that hung between us. They had always held the power to decide what I was allowed to experience, and now that power was gone. I had taken it, quietly and completely, without asking for permission. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years they had excluded me from family vacations, leaving me behind without apology. Yet the moment I created my own, the outrage was overwhelming. Their anger wasn't about the trip itself. It was about the fact that I had chosen myself over them, that I had proven I didn't need them to live fully, that I had dared to enjoy the life they had denied me. At first, I carried guilt. Old habits die hard, and part of me still feared their judgment, still longed for their approval. I lay awake at night, replaying their reactions, wondering if I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But slowly, the guilt gave way to something else: clarity. For once, I had seen the truth of our dynamic in sharp relief. They didn't want me to belong on vacations. They wanted me to remain dependent, silent, and small. And when I refused that role, they called it betrayal. The more I thought about it, the more I realized their meltdown said more about them than it did about me. My trip was never about rejecting them. It was about reclaiming myself. I hadn't gone to Europe to spite them. I had gone because I had spent too many years waiting at windows, watching cars pull away, convincing myself that absence was all I deserved. Europe was my way of saying enough, my way of proving that even if they chose to erase me, I could still exist, still live, still thrive. Their anger lingered, but I stopped carrying it. I had stood in cities older than any grudge, walked streets where millions had passed before me, breathed air that had nothing to do with my family's narrow judgments. That perspective changed me. Their disappointment, once heavy enough to crush me, now felt small compared to the vastness I had touched. The fallout also revealed the fragile foundation of the family image I had grown up with. They cared more about control than connection, more about appearances than authenticity. My siblings had grown comfortable in the roles they were given, basking in the privileges I had never received. But when faced with my independence, they didn't know how to respond. It unsettled them to see me step outside the frame they had kept me in for so long. What struck me most was the silence that followed the storm. After the initial explosion of reactions, conversations dwindled. My parents avoided the subject, my siblings grew distant, and the tension settled like a fog over every interaction. For a time, I wondered if I had burned a bridge I could never rebuild. But as the weeks stretched into months, I realized something important. The bridge had been fragile long before I set it on fire. The truth was, my family had never celebrated me, never chosen me, never included me. Their outrage over my trip wasn't about loss, it was about exposure. My independence had revealed what had always been there, their willingness to erase me when it suited them. And now, faced with the undeniable proof that I didn't need them, they were forced to confront the hollowness of the roles they had assigned. In the quiet aftermath, I felt something I had never felt before: peace. For so long, I had carried the ache of exclusion, the longing to be part of something that would never truly accept me. Now, that longing was gone. I no longer wanted their approval, their invitations, or their seats at the table. I had built my own table, across an ocean, in streets and cities they had never thought I would reach. And once you've tasted that kind of freedom, you can't go back to begging for scraps. Looking back, their meltdown was a gift. It stripped away the illusions I had still been clinging to, forcing me to see clearly that my worth had never been tied to their choices. Their anger didn't diminish what I had done. It only highlighted how much strength it had taken to do it. For the first time in my life, I understood something vital. Exclusion had shaped me. but it no longer defined me. Their rejection had once been the wound I carried everywhere. Now, it was the reason I had found the courage to step beyond them. The fallout was messy, painful, and raw. But it was also liberating. Because in the end, their anger only confirmed what I had always known deep down. I was never going to belong to them. And that was exactly why I needed to belong to myself. In the months after my family discovered my trip, life became strangely quiet. The storm of their outrage had passed, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and sharp, the kind that pressed down on me even when I was alone. I had expected anger, maybe even arguments that would stretch on for weeks, but what I hadn't expected was the void that followed, the absence of connection, the cold distance that confirmed what I had always known deep down. I was not truly part of them. At first, that silence felt unbearable. I found myself mourning not only the present, but also the past, grieving for every version of myself who had stood by the window waiting to be chosen, every summer I had spent alone while my family laughed without me, every memory I would never be part of. Grief became a companion I carried quietly, heavy in my chest, surfacing at odd times, walking to class, cooking dinner, even standing in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth. It was as if my body finally had permission to feel everything I had suppressed for years. But grief, I discovered, was not only about loss. It was also about clarity. In mourning the family I wished I had, I began to finally accept the family I did have. They had chosen, over and over again, to exclude me, and no amount of longing could rewrite that history. Acceptance was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time, I stopped asking the question that had haunted me since childhood. Why not me? The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was what I would do with the life I had now. That realization became the foundation of my transformation. I began to see my trip not only as an escape, but as proof of resilience. Every step I had taken across Europe had been built on years of rejection, years of silence, years of being left behind. And yet, I had still managed to carve out a place for myself, to stand in the world on my own terms. The same pain that had once made me feel powerless had, in the end, made me unstoppable. I leaned into that truth as I rebuilt my life. I returned to my routines, but everything felt different. Work was no longer just about survival. It was about independence. Friendships became less about filling the emptiness, and more about choosing people who truly saw me. I surrounded myself with those who valued me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. Slowly, I began to create a chosen family, one that didn't measure my worth by conformity or image, but by authenticity. Healing, however, was not linear. There were still nights when loneliness crept in, when I scrolled through photos of my siblings at gatherings I hadn't been invited to, their smiles bright against backdrops of dinners and holidays. In those moments, the ache of exclusion returned, sharp and familiar. But instead of letting it consume me, I reminded myself of the streets I had walked, the monuments I had touched, the life I had tasted outside of their shadow. I reminded myself that belonging was not about being accepted by those who had never chosen me. It was about choosing myself, every single day. One of the hardest parts of healing was letting go of the fantasy. For so long, I had clung to the hope that one day they would see me. One day they would change. One day I would finally be included. But holding on to that hope had kept me trapped in the same cycle of disappointment. Letting go meant accepting that I might never get the apology I deserved, never be invited to the table, never be chosen by them. It meant grieving the family I wished I had, so that I could finally embrace the life I was building without them. The more I let go, the lighter I became. I started to dream again, not about inclusion, but about expansion. I planned new trips, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of joy. I wrote about my experiences, filling pages with reflections on the lessons I had learned. I poured my pain into creativity, and in doing so, I transformed it into something that no longer chained me to the past, but propelled me into the future. With each passing month, I felt myself shifting from survival to growth. I no longer saw myself as the forgotten child, the excluded one. I saw myself as the woman who had endured rejection and still found a way to claim her place in the world. That shift in perspective didn't erase the pain, but it gave it meaning. My scars became reminders not of weakness, but of strength. Looking back, I realized that my family's exclusion had forced me to develop muscles I might never have built otherwise: resilience, independence, and an unshakable sense of self. They had taught me, through their absence, the importance of choosing presence in my own life. They had shown me, by closing their doors, how to build my own. It was a brutal education, but it was one that left me stronger than I ever thought I could be. Healing, I learned, was less about forgetting and more about reclaiming. I would never erase the years of being left behind, but I could reclaim the narrative they had written for me. I could choose to see myself not as the outsider, but as the survivor, not as the forgotten, but as the self-made. That choice became my daily act of defiance, my daily act of freedom. By the end of that year, I no longer feared the silence from my family. It no longer crushed me. It simply confirmed what I already knew. I had built something they could never touch. My life was no longer defined by the seat they never gave me. It was defined by the steps I took when I finally stood up and walked away. And for the first time, I felt it fully. I belonged. Not to them, not to anyone else's expectations. I belonged to myself. There is a moment, after years of carrying wounds, when you realize that healing does not mean erasing the past. It means learning to live fully despite it. For me, that moment came slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the months and years following my trip to Europe. The grief of exclusion was still there. The ache of being unwanted by my own family still lingered in quiet corners of my life. But something had shifted. The exclusion no longer defined me. What defined me now was the life I was building with my own hands. I began to see my story differently. For so long, I had told myself I was the forgotten one, the child left behind, the sibling who didn't matter. But the truth was that being left out had given me a strength I would never have discovered otherwise. My family's rejection had forced me to stand on my own, to build independence, to create a sense of worth that no one could take away. What once felt like a curse had, in its own way, become a gift. I started saying yes to opportunities I once would have been too afraid to take. I traveled again, this time openly, without secrecy, but always with the same spirit of claiming life as my own. I made new friends, built a chosen family, and filled my days with people who celebrated me instead of tolerating me. Slowly, the hollow space my family had carved out was filled, not with their approval, but with my own self-acceptance. The memories of exclusion still surfaced. Holidays, in particular, remained difficult. While my siblings gathered at my parents' house, I spent those days elsewhere, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends who welcomed me into their traditions. At first, the absence felt like a reminder of what I had lost. But over time, it became something else. A reminder of what I had gained. I was no longer waiting by the window, hoping to be invited. I was out living my life, choosing joy over longing, presence over absence. It struck me one day that the most powerful revenge I had ever enacted wasn't Europe itself, it was joy. It was the act of living fully in a life I had built without them. For years, I had let their rejection dictate my worth. Now, I refused to give them that power. Every smile, every adventure, every moment of peace I claimed for myself was a quiet victory over the years of being told, in actions, if not words, that I didn't matter. Looking back, I understood something I hadn't before. Family is not defined by blood, but by belonging. Real family are the people who choose you, who see you, who make space for you without conditions. My family of origin had never done that, but that didn't mean I would live my life without family. I built mine from friendships, from mentors, from communities that accepted me as I was. And in that chosen family, I found something I had never felt before: home. The girl who once stood behind glass, watching cars pull away without her, no longer lives in me. In her place is a woman who has walked streets across the world, who has learned to stand on her own, who has reclaimed her story from the silence. My past will always be part of me, but it no longer defines me. What defines me now is resilience, independence, and the ability to choose myself even when others refuse to. To anyone listening who has ever felt invisible, unwanted, or left behind, I want you to hear this. You are not the absence others create. You are not the rejection you've endured. You are more than the silence of those who fail to see you. You have the power to write your own story, to choose yourself even when others don't, to build a life that is yours alone. I know because I did. And now, as I sit here reflecting on the journey from exclusion to freedom, I can say this with certainty. Being left out of every family vacation once felt like a wound that would never heal. But today, it feels like the reason I learned to stand on my own. The reason I boarded a plane. The reason I discovered the world, not through their permission, but through my own determination. The reason I became who I am. So if this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support means everything, and your story deserves to be heard too. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and know this: no matter where you are, no matter what you've endured, you are worthy of belonging. Because in the end, the greatest journey any of us can take is learning to belong to ourselves.